Just a reminder that all lines will be on mute for the program. We'll start in a couple minutes and looking forward to this conversation. Please continue to stay with us. Forward to engaging very soon. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas and the American Society. It's a real privilege to welcome you here virtually via WebEx for what promises to be a terrific program on health-related supply chains in the Western Hemisphere and trade activities and all kinds of interesting things. So we have a terrific conversation planned for you, and we're very pleased you're able to join. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council of the Americas, but these days, what does that even mean, right? Where everybody is virtually positioned and everybody in the organization is one. But nonetheless, we're very pleased to be able to generate this conversation. Hope that all of you in the COVID pandemic are staying safe and healthy and staying at home. So we continue to follow those ground rules ourselves. Speaking of ground rules, this is an on-the-record conversation on disruption and transformation of medical supply chains in the COVID-19 era. It is a joint production of our healthcare series, which is coordinated by Zoe Douth, and she has done a really great job pulling together this program today, as well as our trade advisory group, which is coordinated by Steve Liston, who has joined us recently from the private sector, and he has done a great job as well. And so we thank both of them for their efforts. We also thank Jorge Moreno and everybody else who has coordinated the technological backbone of this program, making it possible for us to do this. This is a sponsored program by our healthcare series and trade series sponsors. I want to take a very quick moment to thank them. Sanofi, Pfizer, Merck, and Roche are our sponsors for this year of our health series, and Chevron is the sponsor of our trade activities, and so we thank all of them for their very meaningful support. Before I introduce our speakers, let me simply say that all of you know that the COVID-19 crisis has disrupted already fragile medical supply chains. Medical device companies are struggling to meet the growing demand, and pharmaceutical companies face similar challenges to deliver much needed supplies to key markets. All of you know that just by reading the news on a daily basis. Production has slowed as the supplier countries have been impacted by the pandemic as well, resulting in a diminished workforce capacity in some cases. And as demand for key medical products grows, some governments have taken the opportunity to enact trade restrictions in an effort to secure supplies. So it does seem to have a cascading impact, and those are some of the issues we want to begin to discuss today. So the aim of today's panel is to discuss how we can improve supply chain management and join forces public and private sector for a coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic and also future health crises. And unfortunately, one thing that we can predict during this age of uncertainty or this age of chaos, as I've seen on Twitter, is that unfortunately this will not be the last pandemic we face. So the lessons we learned today will definitely be relevant for the future as well. We've assembled some terrific speakers, and our hope is to generate some practical and pragmatic recommendations that can be provided to governments to improve supply chains, build resilience of supply chains, and meet demands for medical supplies. And of course, this is a conversation centering on the Western Hemisphere, but the thoughts and ideas and reference points will undoubtedly be relevant to the global supply chains as well. Before I introduce the speakers, I have one program note. The one thing that you learn in the era of virtual reality, if you will, is to deal with uncertainty, to be flexible. And in that regard, two of our panelists have come to us urgently to say that they have family health crises and will be unable to join our panel today. So our thoughts are with them, certainly, and we hope for very quick recoveries. But nonetheless, we have two terrific panelists to continue the conversation, Kevin McAleenan and Martin Olmedo. Kevin McAleenan, as probably all of you know, because you've been with us for the Washington Conference in the past, you've been with us for other activities, is somebody who's no stranger to the Council of the Americas. It's been my personal privilege, but also the privilege of the Council to have hosted him, to have interviewed him, to have discussions with him. And I think you will find, as I have in the past, that he is a very reasoned, very thoughtful, and very pragmatic voice for progress in terms of things that can get done. He is, of course, the former acting secretary for U.S. Homeland Security. His bio, I believe, is available to all of us on this webcast, but very briefly, as the acting head of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Secretary McAleenan was responsible for, just a couple things like counterterrorism, cybersecurity, borders and port security, aviation and maritime security, enforcement and administration of immigration laws, the response to national disasters, detection of nuclear, chemical, and biological threats. I mean, Kevin, my head is going to explode just going through these responsibilities. It's amazing that not only were you able to do them, but to do them so successfully. But what has really attracted us to and really pleased us that he's able to join is because prior to that, he, of course, was the commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Service, and in that capacity was directly responsible for some of the customs issues and some of these issues that we'll be talking about today. And so, Kevin, it's a real privilege to welcome you. And then our second panelist as well is Martin Olmedo, and Martin is joining us from Uruguay. He is the head of supply chains for Latin America for Roche International. And as I said, Roche is one of our program sponsors. And he assumed his position in 2019 to last year. He's responsible for supervising operations, service levels, demand and supply management, inventory, warehousing, and all kinds of things directly relevant to supply chain management. He has been with Roche for over 20 years, and he's held several positions in materials management, logistics, and other departments. He's highly regarded in the industry. He has been awarded several impressive accolades, and he is somebody from the private sector that we're just delighted to have because he's a practitioner. He's one of these people who has to find ways to make things work, even in very difficult circumstances. So with that, we are going to move to a conversation with our two panelists. We're going to shorten this program somewhat because we don't have all of the folks we thought we were going to have. We're going to pull back on the time, but we have as much time as we need for a full discussion with our two terrific panelists. If we were in person, I would ask you to join me in welcoming them with adequate applause. So we'll just send very positive thoughts your direction, Kevin and Martin. Let us go first to former Acting Secretary McAleenan. And, I want to pursue this a little bit from the perspective of your former role at Customs and Border Protection and also in your post-government roles. And, just looking broadly, setting the table for us, building a framework around these issues, what do we need to consider to ensure the resiliency of U.S. supply chains for critical products during international emergencies like this? What are some of the things, what are some of the ground rules, what are some of the key aspects we need to keep in mind going forward that could relate to the Western Hemisphere and certainly to global supply chains as well? Secretary McAleenan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. Very good to be with you. Thanks to all who've joined the discussion today. I look forward to it. So let me start there. You mentioned some of the things I used to be responsible for, really the U.S. Customs and Border Protection timeframe, being responsible for international trade and travel moving across borders, but also coordinating with other agencies like HHS, like the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States on those critical medical supply chains. And then also working with and then ultimately overseeing the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, that's taken on a critical role. And we see that happening in countries globally that are affected by the COVID-19. Just a couple broad principles up front before I dive into the supply chain issues in particular. And that's, I think King Abdullah summarized it very well in a recent op-ed, that this is maybe an unprecedented moment when the top priority of over 180 countries globally is the same. That's a moment of potential international coordination and partnership on a shared challenge that we really haven't had in the modern era. And I think that's maybe an important kind of point to start from. And within that, what we're observing in terms of countries that are mounting effective responses to this crisis is really three key principles up front. One is establishing a clear organization. You need to have a crisis team that's identified, that includes all of the disciplines necessary from, of course, the public health side, but also the emergency management, the logistics capability of a government, and access to the private sector. I think when we talk about a whole of nation response, much more than just a whole of government response, that's the right framework to view these requirements. That team has to have a clear lead. It has to have a decision process, and really importantly, defined requirements for situational awareness. It needs to have reportable and repeatable data collection and to communicate that out aggressively. So that's the foundational element. The second is that coordination, and it's not just interagency within the nation, but it's got to be international. This is a virus that doesn't care much for borders. And where we need to help one another in the response to it, and certainly in terms of the potential treatments or vaccines that are coming in the future. And then third, I think a really important principle with this virus, a pandemic in general, but specifically given the speed and how infectious this particular challenge is early action. Countries that took action early have done better in terms of flattening the curve, but also in the response phase, decisive and aggressive action is going to be critical. So I just offer those three principles up front. Focusing on the supply chain side, I'm not going to cover the testing or eventually the vaccines and treatments as much, and would defer to my colleague on some of the drug and pharmacological interventions that are possible. But really just focus on the personal protective equipment and those aspects of the supply chain that have been so challenging, both here in the U.S. And globally, and talk a little bit about the role of government, the role of the private sector, and then opportunities for cross-jurisdictional or even international coordination on those elements. First, I think some things that have worked well in terms of the role of the government are efforts that are designed to plug critical gaps without taking over the entire supply chain or distribution cycle, or really challenging the current market forces that are overwhelmed, but that have a critical role in delivery and manufacture globally. So I want to point that out. And FEMA, and here in the United States, when they were asked to take over the coordination lead operationally, one of the first things they did was set up a supply chain task force and bring in critical minds from the private sector, but also get that pipeline of information flowing from state and local governments so they understood, had situational awareness of where the shortages were, what was happening, where the biggest impacts of lack of PPE was manifesting at hospitals. And in response to that, they chose to intervene in focused ways. They knew they couldn't take over the supply chain for PPE for 330 million person country overnight, but they knew they had to plug up and shore the gaps. So they focused on key items first, ventilators, N95 respirators, both in terms of stimulating the manufacturing and purchase. And then I think a really important point, and this we'll pick up later in the cross-jurisdictional coordination, they developed an approach of dynamic management of supplies, being able to work with jurisdictions that either were in a different phase of the COVID-19 impact, hadn't yet received a significant number of infections and developed a peak that was overwhelming hospitals, or places that had adequate supply that were willing to share, with the commitment that those supplies could be moved again should conditions change. I think that principle of dynamic management is important and can apply across borders as well. Secondly, they looked at the areas that were most impacted and prioritized. That's a very hard thing to do when jurisdictions throughout a country are asking for help, or countries throughout a region. Everyone needs ventilators. Everyone needs N95. How do you prioritize really based on the data and where the crises are most severe? And then the third thing they approached was addressing critical deficiencies in the supply chain. I think the most obvious example of this is the fact that globally, the movement of PPE from factories in Southeast Asia, for instance, in China is 200% pre-COVID capacity now on PPE. It's a 30-day cycle to move it on water, which is a traditional way of shipping. So they created an air bridge concept, and they're approaching their 80th flight of an air bridge of critical supplies of PPE to areas across the United States that have deficiencies. So I think that kind of intervention, key items for key areas and addressing critical deficiencies, is the kind of thing that governments can think about to focus their efforts to support the medical device supply chain. The other area that I think is really important to discuss on the supply chain is really looking at that regulatory framework, right? Medical devices and equipment, including PPE, are highly regulated internationally. Regulatory authorities need to adopt new flexibilities, both in terms of emergency approvals of new devices, exceptions for existing devices, accepting certifications from other jurisdictions. One could be FDA certified, one could be certified by the European Union, one could be a China certification. Being able to flexibly import from a variety of sources where a product's been reviewed and used successfully is an important thing for regulatory agencies to consider. And then, of course, enforcement discretion. There are reporting requirements, there are letter requirements for all types of medical devices and equipment. Regulatory agencies should consider waiving or really limiting enforcement activity during the peak of the crisis. I think the point is to get the material to the frontline medical professionals who need it at this time. The other aspect is really trying to stimulate that innovation. We're going to beat this disease as a world, as a globe, by innovating out of it, both on the vaccines, the treatment side, and better practices to prevent people from catching it in the first place. That means diagnostics. It means contact tracing applications that protect privacy. So investing and supporting dynamic procurements and assuring that companies that have ideas can get funding for their research and development of those products, I think, is very important globally as well. Taking it down to the customs level, there are some very straightforward and simple steps that governments can take on importation issues. Waiver of duties for medical supplies. Obviously, revenue is critical for all national governments, and most governments in the Latin American region depend on value-added tax and import duties. For certain products in this crisis, those need to be waived to allow them to flow more quickly and more cost-effectively. Classification issues. This would be exactly what type of product are you importing? For instance, there are many different types, several key categories of N95 masks. You need to understand whether it's a general importation, a NIOSH or KN95 or a surgical N95, and be able to declare that effectively as that's brought across borders. And then, of course, customs agencies are going to be worried about counterfeit enforcements. Unfortunately, we do see some profiteering occurring and less scrupulous manufacturers trying to present products of inferior quality as critical surgical quality products. That's something that's going to have to be watched for, again, across borders, and ideally have that information shared. The last thing I think that the customs agencies need to be worried about, and really all frontline agencies, are workforce disruption, where they have personnel that are either sick or been exposed to people with COVID-19 or are worried about coming to work due to potential exposure. That's going to affect their prioritization of work. And again, critical supplies need to be prioritized. But you have to have a plan for this, especially if you're in the stage where you're getting ready for the pandemic to be increasing in your country, as opposed to already dealing with a full-blown pandemic. The last 2 points I would make, I think you really need that the medical experts and the product experts involved in the supply chain procurement process and in the customs advice process. That's not something that happens day to day. So making sure that those communication lines are open and strong, I think, is very important. And then lastly, I just think that as this crisis continues to develop internationally, when we do see countries that are building additional capacity, for instance, the U.S. Using the Defense Production Act is starting to develop an adequate capacity of ventilators, and is able to share with countries like Honduras and El Salvador, as announced last week. That's the kind of international support and that dynamic management of available critical supplies that we're going to need to see more of. And I do think there's an opportunity in Latin America in particular, where the epidemic's been slower to develop in some of the smaller countries, to band together now and enter into those kind of agreements so that they can help each other, almost a mutual assistance approach as this pandemic develops. And I think that's going to be really important in Central America and other parts of South America. So thank you, Eric, for the chance to participate. Happy to stay and continue the conversation with the folks online, and look forward to it.
Well, thanks very much. You've put so much on the table. There's so much there to unpack. Martine, before I go to you, I want to follow up. Kevin, you raised several points I'd like to follow, but I want to focus on the risk, the balance of risk aspect of what you just raised. I mean, many of the things that are common sense in terms of getting products in where they're needed rapidly and quickly, and, tax abatement and regulatory, issues, things like that. But then you've got the whole side of things in terms of counterfeits and people trying to take advantage of enforcement, et cetera. How do you balance that in a way that public health is actually enhanced as opposed to put at risk from, for example, counterfeit pharmaceutical products or, what have you? I know there's no probably right answer there, but how would you begin to think through that process, and how would you advise, for example, a Latin American or Caribbean government to begin to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I think those answers are different for the type of product, for sure, in terms of how you balance the risk. I think for PPE in particular, the balance should be get as much supply into the right places as quickly as possible. If you have counterfeit issues, you can address those after the fact, as opposed to at the border in a way that slows down those shipping lanes. On the pharmaceutical intervention side, I think our next panelist might have some observations on this as well. But if you're talking about things that are going to directly affect health and safety, for instance, that's one of the conversations right now on the vaccines. The reason they need such extensive human trial is because if you're talking about a population level inoculation, you can't make a mistake. The consequences could be so severe. You've got to have enough test cases to know that it's going to be safe to inoculate an entire population. So I think the risk balance is very different with the different types of products that are going to be involved in addressing the epidemic. But, for the PPE side, I would favor aggressive moves, waiving taxes, making exceptions, approving products that are certified by other countries, much more expeditiously than these types of regulatory agencies typically move.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. And let me follow up with one additional question, and Martin will come to you. And that is the question you raised right at the beginning, that in a pandemic, you raised, the quote from, I believe it was King Hussein, we're all in this together, but at some level, we all need the same stuff, right? So the demand has gone through the roof. The supply is slowly increasing, or rapidly, but still it's not meeting complete demand at this point. And so the question is, from a customs perspective, from a supply chains perspective, how can we work together to try to make sure that we're not instituting beggar thy neighbor policies, right? I mean, there are some really desperate populations in parts of the world, certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean, who simply can't get product because maybe they can't outbid the highest bidder. And I just wonder, are there things that can be done to, or is this simply we're all at the mercy of the market, and that's kind of the way of the world? I mean, are there things that can be done to mitigate?
Yeah, Eric, I think that's a really important question, and has been, frankly, one of the most challenging questions on the supply chain issues just within the United States. I mean, we see states competing against one another, bidding against one another, and FEMA in certain cases. And it's a delicate balance. You don't want to take over for the market, because ultimately that will be more efficient and will have negative consequences. But you want to make sure that you're not bidding against ourselves. And when it's a global issue, that's definitely a concern. And you've seen reports of developing countries getting outbid as they seek these products on the market. I think one dynamic that's occurring is really the ramp up of supply production globally. This is the focus of every country that has manufacturing capacity to bring PPE online. So we're eventually going to get that market stabilized. But I think the other imperative is that international coordination, to have information sharing across borders, to have regions, and ideally a broader coordination where deficiencies can be identified and responded to, and you have some of that dynamic management of supply where countries aren't experiencing a peak that they expected, or they have an overstock of key items and are willing to share. I think we've got to step up and support one another in this crisis, and that information sharing is not necessarily happening at the international global level. It needs to, and I think we do have an opportunity in the region to start that before we see crisis levels beyond Brazil and Ecuador and Peru into more countries in the Western Hemisphere and Latin America.
Yeah, good stuff. Terrific. Thank you very, very much. And we'll come back to you in the Q&A with the meeting participants. But Martin, you've been very patient, and you are now the representative of the private sector for this particular program. And I wonder, as a practitioner, as somebody who has to day-to-day get the product to where it needs to go, and in line with some of the comments that Commissioner McAleenan has made, how are you seeing the issues in the Western Hemisphere, and what specifically would you like to see from the private sector that governments might be able to do to improve some of these issues and get the products and the help to the people who need it?
Thank you, Eric. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure being with all of you today. I appreciate the invitation to be part of the panel, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you our learnings, but also keen to learn and exchange with all of you. The COVID-19 pandemic outbreak puts all of our processes, systems, and workforce under extreme pressure. And I would like to take a minute to reflect on what we have been able to achieve since the pandemic started, particularly in Latin America. I think it's important to acknowledge that we at Roche have managed to continuously supply necessary tests and medicines to the entire region without major disruptions. And given the circumstances and the global nature of this event, I believe this is a remarkable achievement in itself. Continuously delivering tests and medicines to Latin America means that our global manufacturing network has been working without interruptions. We have put business continuity plans into action. We have partnered with logistics service providers and government agencies all around the world to make that happen. And I think this is a great testimony of excellent global collaboration. I think we all know that in this day and age, supply chains are truly a global phenomenon. As supply chain professionals, we all know that our manufacturing units always count on at least one component shipped from abroad. And also our tests and medicines need to be distributed globally. So I want to reinforce what Mr. Macalinen was saying around the fact that ensuring free and efficient flow of goods between countries, always, but particularly in a situation like the one we're facing, is critical to ensure uninterrupted supply and proper local response efforts. The implementation of the response efforts is local, but we need to have a global network that helps make that possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to manage. I think for the purpose of our conversation today, I think I'd like to highlight some examples of that successful public, private, sometimes local, sometimes international collaboration that made uninterrupted supply possible. And one is, and Mr. Macalinen already alluded to it, is the accelerated regulatory approval from government agencies to allow manufacturers to increase manufacturing capacity in record times. And we have seen examples of these, and we at Roche have engaged with certain regulatory agencies to enable that. And I think looking at the times that you would typically need to get a new manufacturing site approved for the production of any test or medicine, and comparing it with the times that we have managed to get that done, I think that's astonishing and an excellent example of successful public-private collaboration. Another one that refers to certain waivers that were alluded to as well is this is a highly regulated industry, and I think for the right reasons. But during these times of crisis, we need as manufacturers certain additional flexibilities to enable us to maximize our production output. And one example of that has been a very open dialogue we have had and are having with Latin American countries around the flexibilization on product packaging and product configuration. And I'm very happy to say that those discussions have been very productive and have allowed us to import into certain countries where there was an urgency to import product in a different packaging configuration, maybe sometimes in a different formulation, but ensuring that patients ultimately get the medication they need. And again, one thing I'm very, very proud about that I'm seeing happening, that I think is one of the learnings we need to take moving forward as a learning from this crisis, is that we have partnered with healthcare agencies and local organizations to start patient programs that allows for direct to patient delivery initiatives. And obviously, during this time of crisis, the ability to have systems and processes in place that allow for patients to continue their treatments, their non-COVID related treatments, I must say, at their homes became very obvious during the crisis. But I think this is something that has benefits far beyond the crisis situation we're seeing right now. And this is definitely an area where I'm convinced we as an industry and the agencies together, we need to continue to look after and continue to invest, because it will, I think it will bring tremendous benefits. And finally, I think I want to make a point on the timing of the investment and the preparation that ensures readiness to deal with a crisis such as this. I think crisis situations always show that the time invested and on preparing for such events is time and money well spent. And I am very happy to see how all the work and the investment we had done at Roche, particularly in Latin America, with our long-standing presence, with our partnership with local suppliers, with the government agencies, this gives us a unique understanding of the local and regional ecosystem. And this is ultimately a critical success factor for us to maximize our contribution during this time of crisis. It would be very difficult to provide the same level of support and contribution shouldn't we know the local ecosystems as we do. So I think, to finalize my opening remarks and start the conversation, maybe that I think the one critical element I'd like to take forward once this pandemic is over. It's nobody knows when that will be, but we all know it will be over. Is again, I think we need to work with local healthcare agencies and local other partners to accelerate programs that allow for direct-to-patient deliveries, so that we allow patients to continuously receive their treatments at home whenever possible. This is easier said than done. There are a lot of regulations and technology and systems and critical pathways that need to be clearly understood. But I'm convinced that if we take this moving forward, we will be improving the overall standard of care for Latin American patients and systems. So with that, Eric, I hope this was helpful, and I'm open for questions or.
Martin, thank you. That's terrific. And really glad that you can join us even from literally the other side of the globe. Very pleased with that. And we're starting to get some questions which are being forwarded to me. You can do so. You can forward to Zoe Douth. You can forward to ASCOA as the host. We have time to explore those. But Martin, I do want to follow up. You mentioned several things from the private sector perspective, one of which is, you've had some pretty good uptake of ideas from governments based on previous work that's been done in the region. And I think that's exactly the right point. You prepare the groundwork for the crisis when it occurs. And I wonder, are there things, maybe a list of 3 or 4 or 10 things, I don't know what the right number is, that once the pandemic does pass, that can provide a sort of an agenda for coordination and action across the region, so that the next pandemic, we have almost a ready-made menu of things that we already have implemented, we've already put into place, the things we've learned from this pandemic? Or is it too early to begin that process? Are we still considering, just the day-to-day crisis, and there's no appetite, there's no energy to look further ahead? What are some of your thoughts about that from the industry perspective?
Yeah, I think definitely the timing now wouldn't be the right one to pose those challenges to the authorities. To be honest, particularly now in Latin America, we're starting to see the number of cases is elevating. So I think we're in the midst of the crisis, and we should all focus in managing what we have at hand as good as we can. But you have a point. I think we need to make sure we take some of these learnings with us. Because otherwise we wouldn't be better prepared for the next pandemic. And I think, so again, I want to reiterate, I think we need to work across the entire value chain of healthcare to make sure that we provide additional benefits to patients whenever possible. And this means, if we can reduce their need to attend hospital or a clinic, and we can provide the same level of care at their home, I think that will be a unique opportunity to improve the standard of care we have right now. So that would be one that I'm personally very invested in. The other one, I think Mr. McAleenan alluded to something that I think is critical. When we get to these situations where we see this increased demand that no supply chain can really cope with in such a short period of time, the coordination between the countries in a certain region becomes critical, because then we can have a better use of our resources and making sure that we focus on those countries or areas where the criticality is more severe. And I think COVID is a good example. I mean, if I think about Latin America, we're certainly now focusing in countries like Ecuador, where we're seeing a terrible situation, and we need to contribute as much as we can. We have an open eye with what's happening in Peru. Brazil is certainly showing an acceleration in the amount of cases. So all of that in data provides us kind of signals of where our intervention might be needed next. But we cannot manage that alone. We need the governments to work with each other to allow for that collaboration to be realized on the ground, right? And if we see competition amongst governments to get more products to stockpile, to feel safe, then our ability to put the product where it's more needed is not as good as it could be. So I think that's another element that moving forward we should reinforce, right? The level of collaboration between governments in this crisis can certainly be a critical factor. Those are the two that come to mind, Eric.
Yeah, very good. And, Council of the Americas has been at the absolute forefront of this. We had our first program on COVID in the Western Hemisphere in early March, I think before anybody. But one of the reason why I'm mentioning that is because one of our panelists at the time was Dr. Neil Parson, who's a former ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago to the United States, but also a medical professional and somebody who's very accomplished in the space. And this was precisely his recommendation. Look, I mean, this is a train that's coming at us. We see it. We know it's coming to us. We need to coordinate now among, the Caribbean, Central America, these, sub-regional spaces. And I don't know, Martin, maybe you disagree, but at least from the Washington perspective, over the last month and a half, I'm not sure we've seen a whole lot of that coordination. So, that's something I think we can all do a better job, and I really appreciate you raising it. And the other point I want to raise, and then we'll go to some of the audience questions, is, people have asked, why are you doing a health and trade, meeting together? And I think, Kevin, you raised the points very, very well. I mean, we see this perhaps in the context of a health pandemic, which it absolutely is. But to get products to where they need to go, that's a trade issue. That's a customs issue. That's a borders issue. And if we're not looking at this in an integrated way, we can all talk about health outcomes. It's not going to matter. We can't get the medicines. We can't get the medical devices, all that. I mean, maybe that's evident, but I think it's important to raise these points because governments, even outside of the health space directly, have a very important role in all of these. Speaking of important roles and speaking of public-private partnership, I'm not sure if either of you have particular thoughts on this, but a couple of questions have come in terms of testing in the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and the Caribbean specifically, to the extent either of you might have any specific comments on, is the rate of testing sufficient? Are people able to get results? Can we believe some of the, estimates that have been coming out from various sources in terms of the rate of infections and all that? Do you have any thoughts on testing? Martin, maybe I'll go to you first since you're specifically in the medical space, and then Kevin, if you've got any thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, no, I think we at Roche believe that testing is a fundamental piece of the local response efforts to COVID. And we have done everything possible to increase our production capacity, and we have delivered tests all around the world, but also to Latin America in a volume that has never been seen before. As to what the right level of testing is for this, I think there are many experts that can speak to that better than me, epidemiologists, and it's difficult to say because it's not only the amount of tests, but it's also the amount of positivity rate you get and the amount of the sample. So I think massive testing has been recommended by the WHO, and when possible, I think is recommendable. The other point is if the amount of tests or if the capacity of a healthcare system to test is limited due to whatever reason, I think there needs to be some smart decisions around whom and when to test to get the more out of that decision to take corrective actions. So that's what I think, and I think the level of testing varies across the region significantly. So I think this is something that we would need to look at on a country by country level, and it's difficult to make draw any regional conclusions. I don't think is easy.
I think those are fair points. Kevin, any particular points on that? And then I want to ask you a supply chains question.
Yeah, I agree with Martin, and frankly, it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I guess the one point, he made that point about being very strategic in the populations you are testing, if testing is a limitation. I think there are some examples, both jurisdictionally in the US and internationally, where very careful sampling has helped inform areas that are going to become hotspots or how to respond to existing hotspots. in important ways, even if you don't have enough tests to do it comprehensively, and then having a mechanism for presumptive COVID cases based on symptomology and results. Those two things can kind of plug the gap of being able to do comprehensive testing, but agree with Martine that the WHO recommendation and CDC recommendation, comprehensive testing is the way to go, and we've got to keep trying to build global capacity to do it with good, accurate tests.
It's probably a cliche at this point to say it, but there is opportunity in crisis. And I wonder, particularly from a Western Hemisphere perspective, Kevin, to you, I mean, look, supply chains are global. We know that companies source product and manufacture wherever it makes the most sense to do so from their perspective. But I wonder if you were advising or making suggestions to Latin America, public, private sector, what have you, in terms of ways to create conditions that would attract investment in supply chains, particularly in the healthcare space. Might there be any ideas or suggestions that you would make off the top of your head? That's another question from one of our audience members.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and it's obviously one that started coming up really early on in this crisis with Chinese manufacturing capability, really dropping off the table as they address the initial impact in Wuhan and Hubei province. It's also kind of a conversation about increasing options for critical elements of the supply chain and increasing regionality as you look at time from manufacturer to consumer or delivery. I think it definitely applies in this space. Critical manufacturing capacity for medical devices and PPE should not be located in one country or in one region. And that's really what we have here. So how do we balance that out? When we know we have manufacturing capacity in Latin America, we have free trade agreements like CAFTA available. How do we stimulate the building of that capacity closer to the region, where both nations in the region can benefit from having it on hand, but also supply chains to countries like Brazil and the U.S. In the throes of a crisis are shorter. I think that's an opportunity we have to look at. And I think to your point, way at the outset, I heard a lot of people talk about the Black Swan event or a 100-year event. This is the fourth near pandemic event in the century. I don't think it's something that we can talk about being unlikely or only every century that it happens. So I think whether we're able to build up that capacity during this crisis or it's something we talk about as a response to it in the region, I think we should have that conversation. I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, really good comments. Thank you for that. And I want to key on your comment just now in terms of speed, rapidity, right? Ability to make rapid decisions. And, this is the fourth pandemic or near pandemic this century, which is a very sobering thought, to be sure. So Martine, from your perspective, I want to key off of that particular idea. Obviously the traditional ways of doing business maybe no longer apply, and certainly going forward, I think you both mentioned the world is going to look different the day after the pandemic than it looked the day before the pandemic. I wonder, from the AI perspective, artificial intelligence, machine learning perspective, are there tools that you or the industry broadly are employing so that the impacts of these these disasters are lessened right from the outset, right? So that they don't even begin to mushroom into the way that they might otherwise would be. How are you incorporating some of those tools in terms of your own business?
Yeah, Eric, it's a great question, and this is a challenge we at Roche had even before the pandemic, but in this situation it becomes maybe more evident. Particularly for supply chain, I think the incorporation of technologies like machine learning or AI should allow us in the near future to anticipate events that could have an impact in our demand. And that would buy us time, basically, right? That would tell us, hopefully in advance, what type of demand peaks we can expect for certain events. And it should allow us to manage data at scale. That's how we call it at Roche, right? today we use a certain amount of data to try to estimate our demand and to try to plan our supply. And I think the new technology should allow us to incorporate into that data set much more abundant data that we're typically not using today, but might serve us very well in our ability to better predict what might happen. And I think time is of the essence here, right? So if we would have known about this 2 months before, I think the level of preparedness and readiness from the entire system would have been completely different. And to that, I think that also should encourage us to think in terms of capacity, not only manufacturing or supply chain capacity, but also healthcare capacity in more dynamic terms. Because I think one of the risks of situations like this is we cannot really be prepared 100% of the time for a pandemic such as this. It would just be too costly and too big of a burden for the overall system. So the challenge is really how do we find dynamic ways to be able to increase our capacity rapidly and then kind of take that back to the normal levels of demand or amount of patients a system needs to treat. I think that's the challenge, and that is where technology can be of great help to all of us.
Yeah, Susan Siegel is the president of the Council of the Americas, and she frequently says data is the new king, right? So it affects all of us, even in the nonprofit world. So thank you for that, those very important comments. We have one final question, which I think is probably good because, as I mentioned at the outset, with only 2 panelists, you've more than earned your keep today. You've spoken for 4 people, and we don't want to take the program to its original time. We're going to end it at approximately 3 o'clock, so that gives us time for, I think, one final question, and it's a very good one. It's a very relevant one, and I'd like to ask the question to both of you, which is to say, the role of international organizations. We really haven't talked about those very much today. Know that neither of you is a representative of international organizations, but whether it's the WHO, which you did mention, Kevin, or PAHO, or other groups, is there suggestions or ideas in terms of ensuring a coordinated distribution, really, or provision of medical supplies in a global health emergency? We did touch on some of these things a little bit from the private sector and beggar our neighbor policies and all that, but we didn't link it to the global governance structure of the WHO or what have you. And I wonder, is that something that we need to be discussing more, thinking more, incorporating more in terms of our own thinking? Why don't we go first to Martine, and then we'll finish up with Kevin.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm muted. No, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, generally speaking, I believe that international organizations have a key role to play in ensuring that this country collaboration and international coordination is in place. I think that that's their key role. I mean, ultimately, it's always a local effort in the response. So there needs to be a balance between what can be managed by this international organization and what needs to be managed by local organizations or governments. We, of course, from a Roche perspective, are partnering with both these international organizations and with the countries. And I think it's not an either or question. It's a question of how do we best integrate. I don't think we can leave it only up to the international organizations to solve the issue, to be honest. And it is also something, definitely an area where countries need collaboration and stimulus from the international community. So I think it's a bit of both, Eric, to be honest.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Kevin McAleenan, to you for final word.
Sure. I agree with those points. First, look, we're going to have an opportunity to review the global response to this as we push through the crisis. And I think the WHO structure, approach, their enforcement mechanisms, those will all be reviewed and hopefully strengthened coming out of this, because I do agree with the thrust of your question that international organizations are going to be essential. And hopefully we're going to see that in the restart process, especially as you look at things like international travel. The International Civil Aviation Organization, WHO, the UN, we're going to have an agreement on standards. We can't have different approaches being taken at every one of 185 borders, for instance, on international travel. Even within Europe, you have discussions over temperature checks at continental European airports, but not being applied in the UK because the public health authorities there don't think it's probative of COVID-19, given the latency and the fact that a lot of people are asymptomatic but still infectious. So those kind of things do require international coordination and standard setting, and international organizations have an essential role in my view. And I just wanted to add one point on the artificial intelligence piece. I think technology is going to help solve a number of these issues, whether it's diagnostics, obviously the medical side, medical treatment side, vaccines. But one area that should be solved by AI really is contact tracing. The old methods of taking down phone numbers and email addresses and then trying to find people who might have been seated near someone on a flight or in the same office building, we can do better. Everyone has a device. I think the Google and Apple collaboration with a model that protects privacy, that has opt-in capability and voluntary aspects is really important. And it's something that I think we can solve, really in a global way using emerging technology and AI capabilities. So just an optimistic point on that. I think there's a way to do that better and more aggressively globally.
What a terrific point. And I should have come to you to have a chance to respond to that question. I'm glad you mentioned that. As I said, our two panelists have gone above and beyond the call of duty. We're delighted that they were able to spend so much time with us and go so deeply into some of these issues. Before we close, three quick things. One is to thank again our sponsors of the Health Series and our trade activities, Roche, Merck, Pfizer, Sanofi, and Chevron. And the second thing is, for those of you who are members of the Council of the Americas, you're aware that we have upcoming events and programs on these health-related issues with specific reference to Colombia, to Peru, to the Dominican Republic, and the Caribbean. We're moving forward on these issues, and we continue to do so, and we encourage you to join with us to the extent you are interested and available to do so. And the third point is simply to thank our panelists for a terrific discussion. I like to think I know some of these issues. I was just soaking up the information like a sponge. It was really good. Thank you. Thank you for being available. Thank you for your insight and your willingness to share it with us. And I hope you'll come back and continue to engage in these dialogues in the Western Hemisphere. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us. That concludes our program for today. We'll see you again soon. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.